Right. Okay. Okay, let's start. 1501. Okay, so again, welcome to today's session. This is about safe chemistry in the fashion industry. And we will have a conversation together with Scott Eccles and Eliana Benmayor. As you can see, Scott has this sign at the back, Roadmap to Zero from CDHC. He's the program director of the Roadmap to Zero. And I've got Eliana Benmayor from A Transparent Company, founder and director, and also a consultant to CDHC. So just a few words about what we've been doing here at our end. So I'm sitting in the studio again of the Sustainable Angle with all the thousands of materials in the background. We had a whole week of our Future Fabrics virtual Expo live event. So today is the 7th day. And we had discussions in the morning with, for example, Advanced Denim on our Instagram Live account. We had several sourcing sessions where we take an iPad and we go through all of the materials and help source the brands who can't be here or who are abroad and nobody can travel. And so we're trying to bridge that with our digital event that's been going on all week. And tomorrow's our last day. It's going to be our open day and we'll have more fabrics that we present. Also today we've actually got our Instagram has been taken over by Doppelhaus. Liliana's going to talk a little bit about what you see on this card in a second. But so Doppelhaus is a mill working with British wool, basically non-woven, innovative company. And check out the Instagram accounts and how what they're promoting today, all about sustainable materials, as always. So I'm going to let Liliana introduce herself and talk a little bit about her company, her work at CDHC, and also how we actually got to know each other and how we worked with each other over the last few months.
Hi, Nina. Thank you so much for the intro and for having me in your amazing live for this week. So exciting. Yes, I'm Liliana and I'm the founder of A Transparent Company. We are a London-based consultancy and we focus on transparency and traceability in supply chains for fashion. Our mission is to accelerate positive impact, and we do so by tapping into enabling technologies, which means new technologies that help create greater trust and therefore transparency in what information we read. So actually the hanger that you just had showed us with the QR code, that was featured in the last Future Fabric Expo last January here in London, where more than 2,000 people came. And the idea is that with your phone, you can just scan it, tap it, open the information, and it takes you straight away to the virtual expo with the material information, so you can take it with you and you can bookmark it. And then by the end of the expo, you will have a library of materials that you are interested in. So we're looking at how to connect physical products with digital stories and how do we back that with data that has a more robust source of information. So yeah, that's part of how we've been working with the Sustainable Angle. And yes, I also work with CDHC Foundation in various projects. And one of them is really exciting and dear to my heart, since as you may know, the Sustainable Angle has 5 criteria, and we are looking into the new one, which is chemical. And we've been working on this since April. And yeah, this is why Scott is here. He's been the great support on the science part and understanding what are those data points that we need to understand when we look at material in terms of chemistry. How do we educate ourselves more to understand as a fashion industry? My background is in fashion design, so definitely not chemistry, but it's just so imperative for all of us to understand chemistry in a way that we understand how to communicate this to then the end consumer, which is the fashion customer. So yeah, we will be discussing more on this.
Thank you very much, Liliana. Right, Scott, let's hand over to you. If you want to quickly say what kind of work you do at CDHC, in particular to the Roadmap to Zero, and then maybe we can ask you quite a few questions on your work, particularly.
Yeah, no, thanks, Nina. It's good afternoon, everyone. I'm assuming it's afternoon for most everyone there. It's hello from Portland, Oregon, in the United States. It's still a bit early here, but I'm happy to be here, and thanks for the opportunity. I do work with ZDHC. I'm the program director for the Roadmap to Zero program. And I'm excited to be here because I spent the first 15 years of my career in environmental chemistry, and a lot of that time was spent gathering samples of whether it was fish or mud or water, and analyzing for chemicals that we were trying to keep out of the environment. And then I've spent the last 20 years of my career working on the product side, and was lucky enough to work at Nike and other companies, and really get involved in trying to remove the chemicals from the process before they get into the environment. So my background's in environmental chemistry and textile chemistry. I've been working with the Roadmap to Zero program since I was, when it first came out of the brand's response to the Greenpeace detox campaign in 2011. I was at Nike at the time, and I've been working for the most part, whether I was at a brand or now working with the Roadmap to Zero itself, for the better part of the last 9 years on this effort to really remove the hazardous chemicals from products. So I'm happy to be here and talk to you about things you can do, even though it might seem like chemistry is not something that is in your normal day-to-day. There's still decisions you can make that, even if you maybe not realize it now, will affect the chemistry and how we use them. So thanks for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you for taking the time, early morning especially. So basically, I think, why don't we start with, would you call it, there's three basically terms that are being used almost interchangeably, and I just wanted to ask you a little bit how you prefer to refer to it. So is it more green chemistry, sustainable chemistry, safer chemistry, or safe chemistry? What is sort of your personal preference?
Oh, that's a really good question, and you could find people that would probably spend half their day arguing about which term it should be. Normally, I would refer to everything as safer chemistry. There's, you can't really say something is absolutely safe. I mean, even sugar taken in large quantities can be harmful to something. So I always want to look at like what's safer, because we're always faced with a choice. Can we, do we use this material or this material? And one is, could be usually safer than the other. So it's usually safer chemistry. And the way that you can get there from a chemistry standpoint is there's green chemistry, which is a set of principles, and nobody wants to hear about the boring details that the chemists worked out, but green chemistry really tries to use processes that are safer. And you could think of it as maybe a cooking example where you make sure that when you're cooking, you're not splattering grease all over yourself and causing burns, and so you're doing things in a way that are safer, and you're changing the way that you might do things. Sustainable chemistry is typically thought of as a little more broad. So the green chemistry, people, even though people could argue about the definition, tends to be used in terms of removing hazardous chemicals and more of a, how do we make a chemical safer? Sustainable chemistry, which is what I prefer to use, because what we really want to do is, in a very broad sense, use chemicals that are not only less hazardous, but also result in saving water in the process. We want to use less energy. We want to overall use less materials. And we even overall want to use fewer chemicals to actually do it. So sustainable, to me, probably captures where we want to go. And green chemistry is kind of a part of that. But people could argue for a long time about the definitions. I think just think in terms of sustainable, we want to use less hazardous, safer chemicals. We want to use less water, less energy, and less overall material use. That's kind of the best way to describe it.
Great, thank you for that. Just on that, if we can carry on in this way, I mean, I have to say, personally, I really like the roadmap to zero. I think it's a really compelling and easy to understand and grasp term or sentence or whatever you want to call it. But the zero in it, because you just talked about relative and so on, this really is pretty clear. It's an absolute zero, can't be more explicit. So how zero really is going to be the roadmap to zero?
Yeah, no, I think that's another really good question. And early on, especially when the detox campaign came out from Greenpeace, it was people resisted zero because it is, as a scientist, zero is not really a concept you can deal with because you can just keep lowering the number. But I think it describes where we want to go. We would like to have zero hazardous chemicals used. Are we going to get there? No, we're always going to have to use chemicals that have some degree of hazard in the way that they're used, or so it's a great goal. It's something that we strive to achieve, and it shows us the direction we're going. As long, if we're going towards somewhere that takes us to safer and takes us to less chemicals used, fewer chemicals showing up in wastewater, we're moving towards that zero. But there's people working to lower, that can analyze for chemicals and looking for lower and lower amounts. And so that zero number, what you could find today, keeps moving. If we'd have gone back 100 years from today, people couldn't find those chemicals at such low levels. And so that is moved. But it's clearly it's a way to easily express, look, that's an aspiration and we'd love to be there. And as long as we're doing things that are moving us in that direction, we're on this kind of continuous, infinite journey towards making things more sustainable, safer, and moving in that direction.
Right. And I want to bring in Liliana, of course, into my next question, because of course, and this is in your, looking at your website, etc. Our listeners can follow up on that. And of course, it's as much the supply chain is, of course, where you're focusing on, but a brand and a designer has a role to play. Of course, that's your fourth kind of part in it. So let's assume we're looking at it, and this is why it's great to have Liliana here, who's also more on the design side originally. If we're talking about something, as you refer to it, as a holistic systems approach to sustainable chemical management, from a design and a brand point of view, what does that really mean? That is actually can almost be interpreted as something that, people might think like, I don't even want to go there. What does that really mean? So maybe if we can talk about, first of all, what does that really mean in the context of the roadmap to zero, but also from Liliana's point of view, how do you think all of this need to be better communicated in a way that is perhaps more tangible and approachable from a design and a brand's work point of view?
Yeah, thank you. I think taking from Scott's point of being an infinite journey, I think that's really important to understand that we are all in this journey together and nobody is perfect. And I believe, just to touch on the zero, it's about setting the bar high. So we aim for the best. We are all in this journey, and if we look at the supply chain, from suppliers, farmers, mills, designers, brands, and even the consumer, we all want to do better. And in order to do better, we need to have clear information that we can trust. And yes, my background is in fashion design, and one of the reasons why I decided to step out of design per se and enter the world of redesigning supply chains is because information is not available in a clear way for everybody to make an informed decision. It's like when we go to the supermarket and we want to put ourselves in the best diet possible, we are going to look into the ingredients of the products that we're buying, so we make sure the diet that we're choosing is going to be as detox as possible. And this is an approach that is quite easy to understand for designers and brands perspective when looking at chemistry in fashion. I just want to point out this book by CDHC is really helping bridge designers and the information and the program and the tools that CDHC has. And it's just making it super easy and simple, and it's free to download. I invite you to download it. It just tells you and explains you more the history, the context, and what are the tangible steps to look at as a designer for chemicals. And this is why this collaboration between the sustainable angle and CDHC is so important. And I'm thrilled because that chemical criteria will help designers and brands to understand more about what they're buying, and also the mills to learn how to communicate to designers and to highlight those data points that are relevant and that make them unique.
Scott, do you want to add something to that?
No, I would say that, that part of what Eliana pointed out is everybody's on this journey together, and the most important thing you can do is just get started. Start by asking questions. And as Eliana said, if you're going to the grocery store and you're buying groceries, you might want to know where the products came from. You might want to know where were the fish, where was it fished from? Where did things come from? And you don't need to understand chemistry really to ask the questions. I think part of what the sustainable angle is putting together is, here's the 5 things you really need to ask questions about, and you should be asking for, certain either certifications or ways that they're handling the materials. And as a designer, that's the most important thing you can do for this whole effort, is to ask questions. Because if you're not asking questions, then it's hard to, you can have people from the chemistry side saying this is important. But if the customers aren't asking the questions of the companies, they don't see it as important. When customers start to ask questions, then they realize, oh, that is something critical, and we need to have an answer for it. And so I think, don't worry about if you don't understand chemistry, if you didn't like chemistry, you don't have to understand the details behind it. What Sustainable Angle and what ZDHC are really working on is trying to bring things to life that help people make decisions without having to understand a lot of the underlying details. So when you go to the store, you look for the sticker on the produce that says, it's organic or it's biological, so that you know that it's been produced in a certain way. But ask the questions and just get started. Those are the 2 critical things from a designer standpoint that I could have.
Mm-hmm. And so this is exactly where then we often get asked by the brands who are coming to source, what questions should we actually ask? It's exactly that, how to formulate it. And there seems to be such a barrier, and this is of course why we're excited to work with you guys. But that's precisely, I think, where probably this was a stumbling block for a very long time, and we might have been much further, because it seems from your work and as far as we've now worked together, there has been so much advancing in chemistry, and it seems almost that a lot of people are unawares of it. It would have also meant probably, if they were more aware of it, they would have communicated it again, as you say, on a sticker or on a label, and there you have a whole sort of virtuous cycle that then follows. And that seems to be a bit of a shame that we actually haven't really made that much progress yet, even though it's, from a technical point of view, so much has been progressing, right?
Yeah, no, I think so. Go ahead, Nelia.
Oh, I was just going to say that I think part of that journey as well, we need to look at the macro perspective. I guess Scott and I taking the food industry as the most common example, as we all eat food and we go to supermarket and we choose whether we go to the bioorganic shop or the regular. So it's part of our decision because the information is there. And then we can look at the cosmetic industry as well, how much it has advanced in the past years. There's a lot of brands creating products for vegan customers. Also, there's been more understanding and education about what cruelty animal free means, and so that has happened in the past few years. And from my perspective, in terms of fashion and textiles, it is a next industry that consumers and brands and designers are looking at more, as to what extent to understand how a material in our bodies can impact our health, and how is that impacting the health of the workers in the factories and also in the environment. So I'm really excited that fashion is ready to speak chemistry. Up to you, Scott.
Yeah, I was just going to add that I think to your point, Nina, about we should be making maybe more progress. I think Neliana's right. We're kind of sort of behind where maybe the food industry was or cosmetics. They have kind of a lot of legal structure in place in most areas to drive them, whereas the fashion industry really hasn't had that, and it's really been a kind of an organic growth within the industry that's created this for a large portion of what we're doing. And I think that at some point in the future, we would like to have like one gold standard of like, if it has this, then everything's taken care of it. If it has this stamp on it, everything's perfect. We're far from that today. Maybe we'll get there someday. I think today is the key is just to ask questions, and what people will see in the criteria you put together is maybe there's 2 or 3 standards that address chemicals maybe in slightly different ways. And I think people shouldn't get too hung up on, well, that standard is slightly different. And I think the point today is that, if you're covering 80% of the problem with a standard and they're addressing most things and you're asking those questions, it will naturally drive things to be more complete and more aligned. And so today it's just, has anybody ask any questions about it, rather than worrying about whether the certificate in the UK for organic biological produce is slightly different from the one that they might have in the United States. Just people looking for those certificates is the critical point now, because it needs to drive the conversation so that people are interested in pursuing those and getting those for their materials.
Well, just in terms of chemistry and just how the questions that we're noticing in our work with the Future Fabrics Expo and all the brands that come through our door, etc. One of the things that is very typical is that people assume that anything that is made with natural ingredients or comes from cotton or hemp, linen, etc., that is automatically a sustainable fiber. Now, of course, we all know that, from an agriculture point of view, there's huge differences. But just from a processing point of view, that's where, of course, your work is mainly focused on. And perhaps we can just dwell a little bit on that, what sort of the typical chemicals would be that go into a, let's say, herbal dyes is a typical one that always comes up then. People think, okay, this is dyed with herbal dyes and therefore we're fine, we're a sustainable brand, we only use natural fibers that are herbal dyed. So that might be quite an interesting thing that we can quickly look at. What sort of chemicals are usually involved? Is this something that Roadmap to Zero, for example, even looks at? I don't know. I don't even know actually at all. I do know that one of the most important things to look at is, of course, the mordants. This is the way that, and this would be great for you to explain. You'll explain it much better than me. So if we can just dwell on that just for a little bit, because we had these questions actually recently popping up. So if we can quickly do that as a more of a practical example. Of course, another one is, when it really comes to material, is any of the recycled polyesters that we have in our collection, and perhaps we can take that as the another example on a completely different fiber group, just to give a sort of a practical insight for our listeners.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and it's a big question. So I'll try to address it at kind of a high level, and then you can go deeper if you want. So I think one thing, you're absolutely correct that just because something is made from linen rather than polyester doesn't automatically make it more sustainable or safer, because regardless of where the material came from, whether it was petroleum or from biology of some sort, plants, or maybe a fermentation process in some of the newer materials, you have to use chemicals typically to get that material into some form that people would want to wear. Nobody wants to wear something that feels like a burlap sack or something. So that it's chemicals that are causing those fibers to stick together better. It's causing them to feel softer, and it's giving them the color. Also, another critical point is there's nothing inherently safer about a natural material from a synthetic material, because you can think of snake venom as a natural material. It's not very safe. And so the same thing holds true for a dye that's produced naturally. Now, it may be very well be safer. It may be biodegradable, but there's nothing just because it's natural that means it's safer. It all has to do with the type of dye it is and the type of chemistry behind that. So at ZDHC, we handle them all the same. So if somebody brings forward something they would like to add to our restricted list, if it happens to be a natural dye that people think actually this causes an allergy in people, and you could think of, it's not a dye, but latex rubber has compounds in it that cause allergies in people, and they're naturally occurring. And we look at that from, should this material be used? Should it not be used? Not that it's one's natural and one's synthetic. The issue with like something like a mordant in the simplest way is a way to get, you have a color, you want it to stick to the fiber and not wash out. And the mordant is, in the simplest terms, what causes it to stick to the fiber. And in a lot of cases, especially in the older dyes, that mordant was a heavy metal. And those, for the most part, are fairly toxic. And so something with a mordant in the past was typically may have had some toxicity with the heavy metals associated with it. There's a lot of complexity under that, but I think the important points out of that is that just because it's natural doesn't mean you shouldn't still be looking at and making sure that it's not toxic. And then as we've tried to use a mordant or something maybe in the past to put a more naturally occurring dye and get it to stick to the fiber, sometimes they introduce things that were not natural or that cause toxicity, like heavy metals, to get that natural dye to stick to the fiber.
Thank you. We will probably get questions in the Q&A. I should have said before, of course, we're going to have a Q&A again, as always. And thank you for being available to answer those questions. So if any of our listeners feel that there is a specific thing they want to know more about in this field, then please do send in the questions, and we have a lovely team who will field them and then bring them up to be answered live. Okay, so Neliana, anything you want to say from a design perspective on this kind of field of natural fibers and the sort of intuitively, we're all thinking that this is the better way. And of course, we know that there's a lot of problems with simply the polyesters and other synthetics from an environmental point of view, because they're made of petrochemicals and because there's the microfiber pollution. But if we not look at that, but just the dyes, for example, and the perception of herbal dyes, etc. Did you ever have any encounter with these sort of themes, or what's your experience?
I feel like for designers, it's very important that to avoid assumptions, to assume that just because a label says X, Y, or Z, you immediately going to say, oh yeah, I'll take this and I'm going to then communicate this to the next part of the chain without looking into it more. Of course, when you go to a place that is curated in a way that the information is very clear, like the Future Fabric Expo, that makes life much easier for designers. Yet there is a lot out there, and I feel like sometimes when I see labels in some garments in shops or online, well, online there's not much of, actually, that's one of the issues, but there are more questions, and I feel like when brands do communicate how these garments are made and what are the claims, it's important that they educate themselves really, really well at the moment of choosing these materials. And we're starting to see a lot of brands actually speaking more about chemistry. As you know, this year, the Fashion Revolution launched a new hashtag, "What's in my clothes?" And that's just exactly showing how much consumers are starting to, or will start to, ask more questions about this, as we have seen in the cosmetic industry. And yeah, there are brands getting ahead of the game, but there's still a lot of confusion, and it's a challenge on how this is going to be communicated and how greenwashing won't take place once again in our industry. So this is why right now is such an important time to be discussing this topic in chemistry and fashion, because it is now where we're making huge steps to accelerate what has been in the background for a long time. So I think the key is designers not to assume that because one label says a claim that fits the moment is what you're going to communicate right away to the consumer when the finished garment is made. Just an example in terms of natural materials. If a cotton has been harvested in an organic way and the dye is not, it has some hazard chemicals or is not done correctly, it should not be communicated that it's an organic garment, because there has been a change in its chemical.
Yeah.
So I think that's really important as well to consider.
Sure. Good point. Maybe at this stage we can get a little bit more specific and just on that. So for example, Scott, if a garment made with organic cotton is GOTS certified, how would that fit in with the roadmap to zero?
Yeah, so where that fits in is currently GOTS is one of the indicators of using better chemistry. So ZDHC doesn't certify chemicals through our program. What we do is we go out and we look at programs that are already out there, like GOTS, like Blue Sign, like Okotex, and we accept them as indicators of using better chemistry. And what they have to do is they have to show that for our restricted list, our manufacturing restricted substances list of chemicals that shouldn't be used, their dyes and things that shouldn't be used for finishing materials, that they've looked at it and said that our system makes sure that they're not using those chemicals. And so from a GOTS perspective, you want to look for, just as Nelliana said, you want to look for not only was it grown and produced organically in the field, but once it went from the field, it still met the GOTS standard for restricted chemicals. And they have quite a list of restricted chemicals. It's very similar to what CDHC has for an MRSL. So they intersected as one of our accepted ways that somebody can show they're using better chemistry. And the difference with what they do and Blue Sign or Okotex is they're looking at very specifically the organic part of how the cotton was produced, where those other standards are more focused on the chemicals and the processes that go on after the fiber comes into the facility.
Right. So then if we're sort of staying a little bit more at specifics and technical, at what stage in the process for, let's call it, a garment from natural fibers, in what stage of the supply chain are the most chemicals applied? Can you generalize in that sense?
Yeah, I think in general, it is at the dyeing and finishing stage. So there's clearly some chemicals used during the spinning and weaving and knitting processes. There's lubricants added, there's anti-static agents added, but by far the majority of the chemicals used are at the dyeing and finishing stages, or at the after that, the garment laundering, denim laundering stage. That's where the majority of the chemical use occurs.
I would like to also just point out how important the wastewater management is, because you might have a facility with 5 denim brands who have different type of standards, and at the end of the day, the treatment of that wastewater is really important, because that's also going to affect the environment around that factory and the health of the workers. So it's very holistic, as you mentioned earlier. Like how do we really choose the best product and the best practices from a facility? And it's back to the journey, right? And this is why CDHC is playing a huge part in educating brands and bridging with facilities to really choose best practice and to then communicate this. It's extremely important. I don't know if you want to mention anything about wastewater, Scott.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think that's why it's very difficult if you just say, is cotton more sustainable than polyester? Or, you know, is viscose more sustainable than cotton? Whatever the choices are, it's very difficult in that abstract way to just make a decision because, for instance, and this goes to the wastewater, if I'm dyeing cotton, that takes a lot of salt. And when I dye polyester, that salt's not used. So I may start with something that's maybe thought of as more sustainable with cotton than using the petroleum. I go to dye it, and if the plant where they're doing the dyeing and finishing for the cotton doesn't treat their waste properly, the salt, which is just, you know, it's not something that's going to, you know, burn a hole in your skin or anything. It's salt that can go into the environment though, and it's discharged in the wastewater, and it can kill a lot of the surrounding ecosystem of that water in the local environment. And so when you look at it that way, in that case, depending on the facility you use that processes it, that may cause worse environmental damage than actually the polyester because of the way the wastewater was handled at the facility, because cotton requires more chemicals to get the dye to stick to the cotton. So that's why ZDHC takes a very holistic approach at looking at, we want to restrict all of the chemicals that should be restricted at the beginning. We want those not used. But then we want to look at the process. Are they handling the chemicals correctly in the facility? Do they store the chemicals they do use correctly? Do they treat their wastewater properly? Do they test it to make sure that that's happening? And that's the whole picture that you miss if you just try to say, well, we're not going to use any polyester because, you know, for good reasons, we want to move away from oil. But you may end up creating other environmental problems. And a good example of that is a lot of brands have moved to man-made cellulosic fibers in an attempt to move away from fibers that were from oil. And in doing so, what we've found out is those aren't necessarily produced at the fiber stage in a way that is good for the surrounding environment. So ZDHC has also recently put together guidance on man-made cellulosic fiber production because that was an increased area that people started producing fiber. So that's, you have to look at it in a really holistic way. And that's why you need to know who your suppliers are. What does my supply chain look like? And is everybody doing their part? Not just I picked cotton or I picked, you know, viscose or polyester. You have to look at the whole picture.
Thank you very much. That's really good. I just saw we have quite a few questions coming in, and I know that we have to finish in about 10 minutes. Should we open up to the Q&A? Would you both be happy with that, or anything that we want to add? Yeah. And of course, for everyone, I think the fabulous team has already shared where you can find out more on the roadmap to zero, etc. So that's all in the chat. So we've got Janet coming in, but there's a bit of an echo. I think we need to have a bit more distance from each other to have less echo. I'm going to go on mute. Maybe that helps. Over to you, Janet.
Hi. Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah. Great. We've got loads of questions coming in. Sorry, just trying to get them all up. Okay, so I have one from Shadana who asks, there are two sides to this discussion. Is something that is harmful to the body also harmful to the environment, or are there chemicals that can harm environment but still be perfectly safe to the human body and vice versa?
No, that's a great question. And I
Yeah.
think that, Nelliana pointed out one thing. I would go and look at the detox book that she shared, and there's some good examples in there. But, with chemicals, it's all about, are they what's the amount that's used, and where do they show up? And something can definitely be not toxic to your body, but could cause a problem in the environment. And I think that several years ago, there was a spill of molasses in Hawaii, and the molasses itself obviously is not toxic unless you're eating too much sugar. Then you can get a problem health-wise, but it killed most of the fish in the area of the bay where it was spilled, simply because it caused all the algae to grow and then depleted all the oxygen. And so it's usually a question of where the chemical is. So there's certainly some things that are toxic more to aquatic life than humans. There's certainly things that they go into the environment and you may not see the effects, but they still may be toxic to people. So it's, there's not an either or, and there's no hard and fast rule. It kind of depends on the chemical and how it's, where it ends up.
If I may just add, I think from supply chain holistic point of view, in fashion, we often talk only about social impact or environmental impact. And I think what's really coming very clear is that if the rivers are polluted because there's no correct management of the discharge that comes from these facilities, for example, it will impact the community, it will impact people, it will impact its workers. So I think it's really important to start looking at both impacts in hand to hand, and there are multi-stakeholder initiatives that are working towards this, and it's so important right now that we join the dots and take a look at impact from a holistic point of view, both chemical and water and people and the community.
That's so true. I like that. I think we have to look at everything, not just that one thing at a time. So Gabby has asked, is there a difference between hazardous, contaminant and toxic chemicals?
Oh, that's another good question. So a contaminant is something that just isn't supposed to be there. So that would be a general term for, it could be the dye is contaminated and it has the wrong color because when they produced the dye, there was too much of an impurity that just made it look different. So in that sense, maybe it is toxic, maybe it's not, but it's just a contaminant. Toxic, hazardous, harmful, there are very specific definitions for what is a hazardous chemical, and it's things that are persistent in the environment, that hang around for a long time. It's things that cause something, what's called acute toxicity. You get very sick very fast. Things that cause chronic toxicity over time, they cause you to get sick. Things that build up in the food chain. So it starts out in a little amount, maybe in a plankton, but by the time you get up to the fish at the top of the food chain, it's built up. Like DDT is a classic example of that. But beyond that definition, and we do in ZDHC have the definition that meets what REACH is, and it involves those compounds, plus some that may cause other endocrine problems. Beyond that, people change them kind of depending, because if you say something is harmful, maybe it sounds not quite as bad as saying it's toxic. But harmful could be bigger. Toxic typically means you're getting a reaction, like you're going to get sick or something. Harmful might mean that if I spill this, it might cause a burn, or it might cause irritation. But there's no real definition beyond that specific definition of hazardous. People move those around and use them kind of interchangeably.
I think, again, just to add to that, it's a great opportunity right now where we are to start defining those words in the way that we start communicating chemistry and fashion. I always use a bit of the example of a chocolate factory when they say this may contain traces of nuts, which obviously some people can react really badly to it. So in a way, it's like, how do we translate that, and how do we communicate with the correct term? So yes, I think that's part of the journey as well. That's a good question. Thank you.
Great. That was really good. And then Sonia wants to know, is there, sorry, can you hear me?
Yep. Good.
We lost Janet for a moment.
I'm back, but can you hear me? Can you hear me? Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah, we had a little glitch. Sorry about that. So Sonia wants to know, is there any bio-safe alternatives to replace all the toxic and hazardous chemicals? This is quite a big question, I guess.
Yeah, so first off, there's no assurance that just because it's bio-based, it's going to be less toxic. Somebody's inventing something that they say it's bio-based, it still needs to be checked for toxicity. And there's no way to replace all chemicals that might cause some kind of hazard, because inherently all chemicals are hazardous. In the wrong place, a chemical is going to cause hazard. And the way to look at it is what we're doing at ZDHC is the MRSL, our manufacturing restricted substances list, is the chemicals that shouldn't be used. And we have a group of experts that reviews submissions and it adds chemicals to the list. But then we have what's called the chemical gateway. And that is where manufacturers can find chemical formulations that don't contain those hazardous chemicals. So, the better way to look at it is, yes, people are always striving to produce things that are greener, that have less inherent hazard. They're all going to have some degree of hazard. So people are always working towards that goal, but where manufacturers should be selecting their chemical formulations from is something like the gateway, which has chemical formulations which are verified to have, not have these restricted chemicals in them. But, that's certainly the goal, is to make things less hazardous. But again, it's just like zero. We're never going to have chemicals that have zero hazard. It's just part of, that's just the way that the chemicals interact with things.
Do you have anything to add, Nelia?
Well, I'm just seeing another question, and they're asking about alternatives specific to resin. So I think going back to what Scott is saying is that everything has an impact, whether it's negative, positive, it's a matter of how it's managed. And from a design perspective, I think the principle of design is that whatever you create will have an impact. So as designers, you have the opportunity to choose how much impact you're going to add to your footprint. And maybe, Scott, I'm sorry if I'm jumping to that question, but it's just very connected to how alternative options are available to discuss with designers on better choose what, how do they design their products?
Yeah, I think, again, I'd go back to the simple way is to kind of rely on like the sustainable angle and others to kind of vet those criteria and look for those. I think if you get deeper, and I saw one of the questions pop up here, jump ahead about epoxy resins and things like that. And there are some very difficult problems, especially with adhesives, where people are looking, certainly people have moved away from solvent-based adhesives. There's actually folks that are close by here in Oregon that are using some bio-based adhesives based on how muscles attach to to rocks in the ocean. There's alternatives like that. There's, there have been, I think there's a surfboard company that made an epoxy replacement. The name escapes me right now. So people are looking at those. And so there are very specific problems that people are trying to solve. I think in general, people should look for things that are have some sort of a certification, but then for those specific problems, I think that's where it does become a little more of a challenge to dive in and try to find specific solutions, because it's, the reason the chemicals that we have today are in broad use is because they solve a lot of problems and they made it easy to make products. And so when you try to change that, you may have particular segments of products that it's hard to actually to do that.
Yeah, just to add to that, from a design perspective, when I used to work at Stella McCartney, a company that does not use leather, furs, or feathers, obviously glue adhesives was something that as well was plant-based. So this creates a huge challenge in terms of available materials that you can actually play with. And that's really also interesting from a design perspective, because when you have limitations, that's when creativity comes in, right? And I feel like designers that have the capacity to do R&D and to innovate and to research new materials, I think you are the pioneers of bringing the solutions to the market and to scale it for the companies that may be looking for these solutions. So I really encourage you again to keep asking questions and looking for more, and don't be afraid to experiment, fail, and try again.
Yeah, and I think I spend a lot of my time trying to connect up people that are maybe at the bench level research that I see in the green chemistry world making things, and they don't even know there's a market out there for it, of that people are looking for it. They're maybe making something for paint and they don't realize there's people in the fashion industry. So I see a lot of specific questions. I'm happy to try to send people information on at least where to look a little deeper on some of those. If you send the questions on to Nina, and she can forward them on to me, and I'm happy to respond with at least the limited amount I know. I maybe send you a direction that maybe will provide a little more information.
Yeah,
Great,
I mean,
thank
just
you.
really, yeah, thank you for that. And just really quickly for the UK, actually, there is a company that I have come across that does interiors, and they do a lot of organic paints and non-toxic painting for the house. And they have some actually glues for interior, like for carpet and stuff, which is all biodegradable, and there's no petrochemicals in it, and there's no, it's all made from natural products. But obviously, again, like you say, some natural stuff might also be harmful too, so it's worth having a look at that. I can't remember exactly what the company's called now.
I would add one thing to that, is that's when you do, there are a lot of things being done in adjacent industries, like whether it's paint or building supplies, is when you're working with somebody, sometimes it's not just a drop-in. It might be the same. Maybe there's a bio-based adhesive that works for a building material, and you give it to your manufacturer and say, just try this. Well, they'll try it the same way they tried the current material. And my experience, when I was at a brand, is it doesn't always work the same. Sometimes it has to be heated for longer. Sometimes that things need to be done to make it actually work. It still may work in your application. So I wouldn't give up, but I would make sure that people look at, it's not just the chemical, it's it's not just the recipe, it's how you bake the cake too. And sometimes that has to change. If anybody cooks with gluten-free flours and things, you have to cook it slightly differently than maybe you do with gluten. And that's something that gets left out of the conversation, and then it doesn't work and people just give up on it and they say, oh well, this doesn't work. So that's important to keep in mind when you're developing, trying to switch to new chemistries.
Yeah, no, definitely.
All right. I think, unfortunately, Scott, I think we have to wrap it up pretty soon because you've got a call coming up. So do we have one last question quickly, Janet, or are we done with the questions?
I mean, yeah, no, there's plenty of questions. I guess someone also wants to know, is there like a petroleum-based fiber or chemical that's not hazardous?
Again, it all depends on the situation. It's, you know, the best example is something that people would call a weed. It might be a weed in one person's garden, and in somewhere else, the dandelion might be somebody wants to grow it and put it in a salad, or they may like the flower. And so, you know, all chemicals have some hazard. Even in the water, people have died from drinking too much water when they're running a marathons because it upsets the body chemistry. And so you have to look at it as you know, it's comparing the choices. Which one in this situation gives less of a environmental impact, less impact on human health, less impact to the workers, and it's looking at that big picture. That's the question to ask.
Yeah,
think
it's
I
so
would,
nuanced. Yeah.
wrap up and connect that. I think exactly, we're not in a sprint, we're in a marathon, and this is where we need to start looking at the best alternatives out there, educate ourselves as an industry, share information, and to be okay to not be perfect, to be transparent in a way that you are telling your customers and your teams that you are in this journey and researching more and to innovate more. I just learned this week, just because I think it's so interesting when cross sectors meet, that the nails polish that you use that doesn't come off and all that. It was a dentist who was working, and then she just tried it on her nail, and then she's like, oh, this could work for that. And this is how the whole industry came up. So I think it's really interesting how we can find correlations between sectors and find the solutions.
No, that's great.
All right. I'm afraid we're going to have to end it here so that everyone can still make their 4 o'clock calls. Thanks so much, Scott and Eliana. That was brilliant. Thanks, Janet, for fielding the questions. And we have shared all the resources at the beginning. So hopefully those who couldn't have their questions answered can follow up with those tools you've shared. And of course, we can pass on any questions that come in that are unanswered. Thank you very much, and we'll enjoy this conversation very much. Thank you.
So much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Take care. Thanks, everyone.
Chemicals,
Thank you.
criteria.